This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply, located in the Gem City of Dayton, Ohio. As a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network, we are happy to help you with all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs by providing the best customer service and world-class workshops. Visit CornellStudioSupply.com for 20% off the largest ceramic book selection of all time. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 539 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Brad Klem, whose porcelain forms are decorated with wildlife, disposable plastic products, and corporate logos that draw attention to the human impact on climate change. In our interview, we talk about the China painting process, using multiple firings to build an image and making destruction beautiful. We also discuss moving to Denver with his family and working with the La Serra Collective. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to his website. That's bradleyklem.com. Brad was a contributor to my recent book, The Complete Guide to Low-Fire Glazes for Potters and Sculptors. He wrote a section on China painting, which I am extremely grateful for. So if you'd like to check that out, you can find the book wherever fine books are sold. I'm happy to be returning to Lake Tahoe this summer to teach a workshop at UNR Lake Tahoe. Join me for a low-fire soda and surface design workshop June 16th through the 20th. If you're looking to explore soda at the low-fire range, come on out for that workshop. You can register today at the link in my bio or for searching for the summer workshop program at UNR.edu. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So let's start talking about the China painting process itself. Can you explain what China paint is and how it works?
Yeah, China paint is basically just a powdered glass. There's a recipe just like any glaze, and that glass is crushed up really, really fine into powder, mixed with a flux, and then you can mix that pigment, that mineral pigment, basically with any kind of painting medium, and apply that to an already glazed surface. And then when you put it in the kiln again, it'll fuse to the glass. It'll fuse to your glaze and become glass. So it's great. You can use a water-based medium. I personally like to use oil-based mediums just because that's what I'm used to. And I think it's easier to use. It's just a little easier to work with because it doesn't dry so readily.
With it being powdered glass, like one of the things with our like kind of a typical glaze is if you refire them over and over and over again, you can start to have problems with bubbling or issues. But how is it that China paint can be refired multiple times without it having like our typical glaze trouble?
Sometimes it has troubles.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I guess it can be a little bit tricky. You want to be careful about a few things, but it's pretty controllable. And that's what really drew me to it in the first place, was that I could really gain a lot of control over this medium. Trying to paint with, you probably realized this, trying to paint with glaze or use glaze as something to create pattern or imagery with can be terribly frustrating, especially for a beginner, someone who's just starting out. And when I was just starting out, that's what I was trying to do. I the thing that really drew me to ceramics in the first place, I think the main thing that drew me to ceramics was the surface. And I had been a painter. I had gone to school at Arizona State for painting until I had about 18 credits left in my degree. And I dropped out actually. And I did not go back to school for almost 8 years. And when I did go back, I did not want to go back into the painting studio, but I was still a painter. I still really was interested in creating imagery and things like that. So when I saw ceramics, the thing that I thought to myself was, what an incredible and unique surface. How do I use that? Glaze was not the way. And I was exposed to it through one of my professors there at Arizona State was Kurt Weiser. And I noticed his work and how he was using China paint, which is profoundly amazing. And I asked him about it. He gave me some of his own China paints and oils and kind of helped me troubleshoot a bit, some trial and error. Well, here I am now, still using it, and I still love it. And I'm still learning how to use it. So it can be a little tricky, but at the same time, I feel like anybody could use it.
For our generation, a lot of people think of China painting as being something that older folks would do almost like in a retirement home. Like people would buy blanks, already fired blanks that they would then China paint on top of. And in fact, I think this is just complete conjecture, but I'm pretty sure that the early American electric kilns were sold to China painters. I think that was the market. It was not studio pottery as we know it today. So at one point, it was really prolific in the culture that people would just do this practice.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And it was right. I mean, from what I can tell from my own research, it's right around 1900 or just before 1900 in the arts and crafts movement in America. China painting became huge, and it was particularly popular among women and groups of women that would do this together. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of electric kilns, that's where you find a lot of electric kilns. I have a kiln in my studio right now that is from my grandmother. And she was painting porcelain dolls with it when I was a kid, but it's mine now. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, there is that context of being for an older crowd. And I think maybe sometimes in the studio ceramics community, there is maybe I don't know, a stigma or some kind of feeling about the medium that isn't so positive. But man, is it versatile? And I feel like almost every studio ceramic artist out there could be using China paint in some great way. Even if I feel like even if you wood fire, even if I don't know, it can do almost anything. You can use it to create almost any surface, including, some sort of trompe l'oeil effect, whatever you want.
Part of your practice is that you're putting it on pots that are porcelain high fire pots that you're firing, up to cone 10. And then you're doing the China painting for a second and maybe third and fourth and fifth firing down the line. But it's something that industry used to do, which is like fire really hot and then decorate at a lower temperature. What do you think that general process gives you? Like, what advantage is there to working from high to low versus a lot of studios do it the other way? You bisque low and then you glaze to cone 10 or whatever.
The first thing that comes to mind is that nothing in my studio is safe. I always think like nothing that is still sitting in my studio is safe. I always might change it. And it's like really easy to do that because I'm just using China paint and I'm going to fire it to a very low temperature. It's going to be somewhere between 020 and 018. So yeah, I might have a piece in my studio that's been sitting here for 2 years, and I might walk past it one day and think that needs a seashell right here. I don't know. And it's gonna go in the kiln. I think that's an advantage. I also feel like I don't know, yeah, and I always feel like a pot still has just as much potential now, having been through a glaze firing, that it did when it was only bisque fired. It extends the studio life of a piece, maybe. I'm not sure. Something like that.
The gestation period of that piece being really long also allows you, the maker, to change. Like you're learning, you're growing. And I'm sure when you come back to a piece that's a couple years old or however old, you're going to bring a new idea to it. When you're working on a larger body of work, that's probably really helpful.
It's extremely helpful. I've had pieces that I've made and perhaps spent, I don't know, 30 hours painting. I had a larger piece that I spent at least that much time painting one time, and I had it sitting in my studio, and I just decided that I didn't like it. There was a color. There were these stingrays that I had painted all over the piece, and the color of the stingrays I just really didn't like. It wasn't going in a good direction. I was loading a cone 10 glaze kiln, and I had room for it, and I just put it in the kiln and just melted everything. And it ended up being a really cool piece. I mean, it did very strange things to the China paint. It melted in weird ways. I added more after that. It was ended up being a great piece. So yeah, it's like a longer gestation period. I like that.
Yeah, I like to think that they're growing into their form.
Yeah, they're growing into their form, or maybe something with me is growing as well.
Well, we're going to talk about the content of the work in just a little bit, but I wanted to give people an idea of the process itself. So when you're preparing your pigments, it's pigment and oil. I think it's 80% pigment, 20% oil. Is that right?
Something like that. That's really a number that isn't probably exact. Like it's when I'm mixing the paint on, I have a glass palette, and I have a nice paint muller, this glass flat bottom thing that I can really grind the oil and paint up with. And when I'm mixing it up, I'm looking for a certain consistency. And typically, to begin with, I'm looking for something around the consistency of toothpaste, a really thick, pasty consistency. And then I'll take some other medium, some other oil onto my palette, and I can readily mix into my brush with something that maybe flows better or dries better, some other oil. Um, if I mix too much oil into the paint, this was a problem that I had when I was first starting out. One of my biggest problems was I was mixing far too much oil into the paint. And then when I would put it in the kiln, I would get long runs and drips. But the reason I was getting these drips was not because it was like a melting glass, which you would see with glaze. It was just the oil. The oil was just running down the sides of my pieces. And I didn't actually, it was kind of cool, but I didn't really want that. I was like kind of a control freak. So I found that less oil. You have to go much less oil. Yeah, and I like to use oil. I've noticed a lot of, well, other China painters out there, particularly those I would say working in the studio ceramics setting, are kind of leaning away from oil-based mediums for China paint. I think there's been a trend of leaning into water-based mediums. I, I'm not. I think the reason why I'm not entirely sure. I think the reason that I could see why people want to do that is because they're trying not to use really toxic, stinky solvents in their studio, like turpentine, to clean their brushes. Or maybe they're concerned about burning oil in their kiln. The oil burning off is, in my opinion, not a concern because I cook with oil. I probably, burn more olive oil when I'm cooking pasta than I burn the oil in my kiln. But the turpentine is a concern. I started using just rubbing alcohol to clean my brushes. So I just have some isopropyl alcohol on the side that I clean my brush off with, and it works great. And then the oils that I'm using are a lavender oil and a clove oil, and then just a mineral oil that you can get at the like Walgreens, or CVS. So there's not a lot of a bad smell in my studio. So it's pretty safe to use. It can be safe to use. I would say also when I'm mixing it, I wear a mask and I wear gloves because the powder is very fine and there might be some things in there that you don't want to breathe in, just like when you're mixing glaze, you know. But once it's bound up in the oil, it's pretty safe.
Am I right in thinking that you'll grind for, I don't know, like a day you'll prepare those paints and then you can use those for a long, long amount of time once they're in the paste?
Yeah, you can use them for indefinitely, really. It's not going to go bad, It's just glass. So the oil might harden, but you could reconstitute that. So as long as you keep it, if you keep the oil nice, if you keep it in a nice container, you're going to be able to use that paint for a very long time. So it is a really good idea to pre-mix paints on your palette or in small sealed containers and then keep those, and then you can add a little oil on the side like I was talking about. And to do that, I just use mineral oil.
One of the processes that you do is you kind of draw, quote unquote, with those paints by putting them in. Well, can you describe like what that little object is that you put the paint in that you can hand draw on the pot?
It's just a quill pen. So it's just like, an old feather pen.
Oh,
It's not
that.
really a feather. I mean, they make, now it's like a metal tip that goes into a little wooden stick. But it's a quill pen, and you can use what's called a crow quill or a hawk quill. The hawk quill is much larger, the crow quill is finer. And if you use the right consistency of oil to mix up your paint, it's actually in this case a little bit thinner. You're going to want to use a thinner oil. You can mix it to the consistency of ink. You're sort of looking for the same consistency that you would find in a bottle of India ink, something that you would dip your pen into. And then you can draw directly onto your piece with that pen, getting super, super fine lines. And it really does take on a different look than using a brush, which I sometimes also do. Sometimes I'm drawing with a very fine brush, but I've always loved the way that an ink pen looks on paper. And I'm often drawing with ink on paper with just ink pens. I love how that looks. I love that graphic quality. And I think putting that onto a ceramic surface is kind of weird. It almost feels like it's not what you expect. A brush stroke. You don't expect a pen. And I like that unexpected kind of visual thing that's subtle like that.
And the contrast is just so high, because the ink color is so dark. But in my mind, you were using those. It's like a pen that has a little container on it. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's metal. I don't know what that's called.
I think I know what you're talking about. People use them for luster.
Yeah. Yep. It's like a little luster container that you pour into this little itty bitty metal attachment that's on the top of the pen.
I have used that. I think those are really cool. They're almost like a very small hamster drinking bottle.
Yes.
That's how I think of it.
Right.
They work great. I think they're great. You'd make a very consistent line. It's almost like a ballpoint pen. I have also found that you can dip a crow quill pen into your luster, and it works really good. So if you get a crow quill pen and you want to work with China paint, you can also dip that thing straight into your bottle of luster and draw with it onto your piece as well. Works awesome.
So in terms of like order of operations, you've got your porcelain piece fired all the way up, it's glazed. Then you're putting on the first layer. And let's say you're drawing with that black pen. Is that the first layer and then you fire that on and then you put another color on top of that? Or like what's your order of operations to get the image to us?
Typically it's drawing with a black or a darker line with the pen or a fine brush. Or sometimes I'm also taking drawings that I've done on paper and translating those into some kind of screen printed decal that I could start with as well. Then that's fired, and then I'll start adding China paint. Sometimes I take this resist that's called red resist, and it's a water-based resist, and I can paint that on, and I can apply pigment or luster into very, very contained, sharp, crisp, high contrast areas, and then remove that resist. And because it's a water-based resist, it works very, very well with anything that is oil-based, if that makes sense. So then I'll fire that, and then I'll fire a few rounds of China paints, depending on what the piece is, and then I might even add luster at the very end.
Because I've seen you do layers of color in which there's almost an even fade. Like if you're looking at a sunset, the way that the color fades into each other. How many times do you have to fire to be able to make that fade?
Sometimes just one. And it's all about the application. I'll put that resist that I was talking about, that water-based red resist, and I just use makeup sponges. So I have another medium that is kind of a special medium called grounding oil. And it has a consistency, it has a property to it that reminds me of cornstarch and water. It's like a self-leveling kind of thing. And when I mix that up with China paint and I use just those like round teardrop shaped makeup sponges, I can use a technique called pouncing where I'm basically just, it is what it sounds like. You're pouncing on the ceramic, and you can get these incredible gradients that way if you just really work at it. And yeah, that's all I'm doing.
Because the effect, like when I saw your pots at Demarest a year ago, like I walk up to them and it's almost so beautiful that you can't, like you kind of want to lick the pot, like it looks like candy, you know what I mean? But it also is just makes me go like, holy shit, like what is this, you know? And I was not, even though I've known you, I know this is how you do it. It's still, there's like a transcendent moment with the material where I forget that it's China paint and I just think that it's like, it sucks me in so much that I can't get away from it, which is what we want clay to be, right? Like we want it to have this like allure to what we're making. So how long did you have to sort of use this process before you could get that wow factor skill wise?
Oh, wow. Well, thank you. I do hope for that, and I think sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't. But oh, I'm still working on it. It took a little while. It helped that I had a background in painting, honestly. And so I had done so much oil painting and watercolor painting and all of this stuff long before I ever approached ceramics. I think that probably helps. But I also have this feeling like anybody could be doing some of these things. It's a pretty simple technique, I feel like, but maybe it's more intuitive if you paint it a lot.
Well, I think that wow factor is important for some of the content of your work. You're often pointing at or bringing attention to environmental disasters or climate change or things that are environmental related. And there's this beauty of destruction thing that you have returned to conceptually. And one of those is you did this series where you were just painting plastic bags onto pots. And it's just a simple plastic bag. But because of your skill, it was a really beautiful plastic bag, you know, like those pieces. I remember thinking like, whoa, like this is like, I had that feeling of like, what is this? But then the next step conceptually is like, oh, as soon as this bag is in water, it's going to kill fish. It's going to kill turtles. It's like, it's a very toxic substance. Once that cellophane plastic bag is in like the natural environment. So can you talk about that beauty of destruction thing in terms of the content you're interested in making?
It's like you said. I mean, I love the fact that you said you wanted to lick the pot. That's crazy, but awesome. And I think of, I mean, there's that old line like, the pot serves as a Trojan horse kind of thing. But I always thought like, well, the Trojan horse had to be really beautiful for you to want to bring it inside of your gates, like I think there's other artists out there, not just in ceramics, who make work about climate change. They make work about trash. And I think so often trash is portrayed as trash. And our relationship to trash is that we throw it away and we stop thinking about it. I always think of when I was a kid, I used to go hiking with my dad, and we would always find a mylar balloon in a bush. We would go, real far out into the woods or the desert, and we would always see a mylar balloon. And it's like the balloon, you let go of a balloon and it floats into the sky and it disappears. And that balloon does not exist to you anymore. It might as well not exist. And I think trash is very similar. At least that's kind of how I was thinking about it when I started making that work. And yeah, it's like it's not something you think is being beautiful, or it's not even something you really pay attention to. So I like that question. I like that question of like, why is the trash beautiful? Because if I can get someone to just ask one introspective question like that, then I think maybe they'll start thinking something else that I want them to think. I mean, I can't really control that, but that's probably the best I can do, And yeah, so that I like the idea of like, why is this trash something that would be raised to the level of beauty? And then the other thing about it is I'm incorporating these vessels of modern day, which are very much part of every culture across the world. They're somewhat universal. I feel like a water bottle, or a plastic bag even, is probably a fairly universal is probably not the right word, but it nearly. And I'm incorporating them a lot of times with these very specific historical vessels, these historic objects of importance to humanity. So it's kind of taking the object of history and combining it with the objects that are creating our future kind of thing.
Yeah, and you're harnessing a visual language in terms of the historical part of this that ceramic artists know. Like you'll have a ginger jar form or another form that's from Chinese ceramic history that we all study. Like our generation was kind of raised on this canon of historical ceramics that you're drawing from that, which I think is interesting. But it also is its own skill. Like I kind of divide your work up into, you make really beautiful pots that are then decorated in a nice way, but it's almost two different thought processes. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a refinement to the form that is a whole nother conversation from the decoration. So can you talk to me about your making style when you're making the objects?
I guess that kind of level of craftsmanship is really important to me. I feel maybe it's like I said before, I'm kind of a control freak with my work. Maybe it's just that, But I also, when I look at these historic pots, these historic vessels, like a Minoan octopus flask or this large Iranian pot from the Met that has a ibex sheep on it, I think these things are incredible. It hardly gets better than this, So that level of craftsmanship, I feel, is so important in order to say the thing that I want to say, but it's also maybe it's like also a level of respect for that history and the people who made those objects. I think that kind of respect for the objects and that kind of respect for all of these cultures that these things come from is really, really important for me to pay attention to. While also making this commentary about the things that we make now and the people that are making those things now.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Braypoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Braypoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
You did a piece where you took a bag of ice and then you just cast the bag of ice and then did drawings on over top of that of this like polar bear character on a floating, or I should say on a melting iceberg. And there's something about like that piece for the content to hit home. The bag needed to look exactly like a bag. Like it's like almost like a trompe-l'oeil thing. So that's almost using realism as the vehicle. Because at first, when people look at it, they don't know it's ceramic. In fact, I think you even showed it. Did you show it in a refrigerator at one show?
I took a photo. Yeah, that's a photo of my garage fridge.
Yeah. So talk to me about realism, like why realism is important for that content.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I have almost like a few different ways I approach it, right? Like I have some pieces where I am almost first thinking about this ceramic vessel, historic ceramic vessel that may be thousands of years old, and then thinking about the imagery that goes along with that. And then I also have a few things like the ice bags where I'm more starting out with the modern day container and thinking about the imagery. The ice bags are something I'm still working on. I have a whole series of those that I'm still making. It started just one day I went to go get ice for a party. I think it might have been my daughter's birthday party. And I had to go get ice for our ice chest. And when I went to the store and got it, I picked up that bag and I realized every single bag of ice I had ever seen had a polar bear or a penguin on it with sunglasses on, drinking a cocktail and standing on melting ice, a melting iceberg. And it's printed on a petroleum product. And so I'm like, oh my God, this is a ready-made object. This is ready-made art, really, to be honest. But I wanted to remake that. So then the question was, how do I cast a bag of ice? And the answer is that you really can't. I mean, ice melts and it floats. It's terrible. I'm a little embarrassed to admit that I tried, but it didn't work. So what I found was what I realized was, well, ice is just rocks. So I went outside and just filled the ice bag with rocks. Yeah, I made a mold of that. It worked great.
Well, you tricked me. I thought you did cast a bag of ice. So that's good.
Casting ice is so hard. Actually, I mean, I would never try it again. But a rock is almost the same thing. Or maybe it is the same thing. I don't know. So anyway, so that is a cast ice bag. And then from there, I'm just bringing my China painting to it to recreate the imagery on the surface of those original ice bags. But on mine, if you spin the ice bag around, you'll find that the polar bear is skeletonized. It's no longer alive, but it's still kind of cute and cartoony, and there's a sun with a smiley face. It's very funny and also very dark. And I think dark humor is something that has become really important to me in my work. I spent a lot of time some years ago when I was in grad school. I actually spent a lot of time looking at internet memes. And I got this idea that the internet meme, which has now kind of been displaced by TikTok, and TikTok is still just a meme, but the format is a sound rather than an image. But internet memes as they existed and still do to some degree, I always felt like were this very avant-garde thing. Like the people creating these memes were speaking in a visual language, and they're talking about visual metaphor in a way that us as visual artists are desperately trying to do, and everyone can make a meme. and everyone understands a meme. It's kind of this really cool thing. And there's always this dark humor that's involved in the best ones. So I think because of that, I'm seeking out that dark humor in my work. It feels important to me.
Yeah, and it makes me think of marketing as a whole. That the Ice Bag series specifically. I think about Joe Camel. I used to smoke, and Joe Camel was on. I smoked Camels because of Joe Camel. And I mean, I smoked Marlboro Reds too. So I guess that was maybe the Marlboro Man. So my example doesn't hold hold water exactly, but when I was smoking Camels, I would think about how Joe Cool like that the Camel, they actually even outlawed that at one point because they realized that so many kids wanted to smoke Camel cigarettes because of that cartoon. So it's like really powerful marketing. But when I see the, polar bear on a melting iceberg, somehow that like glossed over my head. You know what I mean? So I like that you're drawing attention to how cute global warming can be. Like it makes us laugh, but then it also makes us go, wait, am I doing that?
Yeah, I almost feel like that feeling of laughing and crying at the same time. It's so connected. And sometimes you have to laugh, or we'll just, I mean, what else can we do sometimes, It's the cigarette thing is really, I think, a great comparison. I feel like so much of the cigarette industry and the petroleum industry is connected.
Big tobacco was the first I grew up in Virginia and went to school in North Carolina. So tobacco was everywhere. Like that was big tobacco. I understood that. Like when they were on Congress on TV getting lambasted for lying about cancer, I was like, oh, wait, that's the tobacco farmers down the road. They're selling to RJ Reynolds. You know what I mean? Like it was a real personal connection being from the South and how prevalent tobacco is. It's less so now, but in the 80s, it for sure was. And in the 90s when I was smoking, it definitely was too.
I think those companies knew what they were doing for long before they got caught for it. And same thing with petrol, same thing with the oil and gas industry. It's the very same thing. And all of the PR firms that made those things, Joe Camel or the Marlboro Man, all of those PR firms are shared with all of the, ExxonMobil has the same PR firm. And one of the things that I think about a lot, or have been thinking about a lot in the last couple of years, is that I want my work to be very, I think this kind of ties in because I really would like my work to be very forgiving of the individual. Like, you're talking about like, I bought cigarettes because of Joe Camel. And it's like, yeah, like we're just like sometimes we're just trying to get by, and we're just trying to do what we got to do. And I think we have this tendency to blame each other or blame ourselves for forgetting our reusable grocery bag when we go to the grocery store or whatever it is. And all of that is it's so wrong. It's the wrong focus. Um, 71% of all carbon emissions in this world come from 100 companies. It's amazing. Like when you think about that number, you realize that us as individuals, we're not doing it. We're not making that happen. And the other thing is the carbon footprint is the idea of an individual carbon footprint was created by the PR firms working for British Petroleum in the early 2000s. And the individual carbon footprint calculator was created by those PR firms working for British Petroleum in the early 2000s. And it's all very purposeful. It's something, when we start to calculate our carbon footprint as an individual or as an artist, even worse, I think we stop paying attention to the policymakers, to the companies and corporations and others that really are doing so much damage in the world.
How do you think making these objects can create some social change or a movement to get politicians involved? Because I really think regulation is the only way this works. I mean, for an example, I live in New Jersey. We don't have plastic bags anymore. So you have to bring You can buy a reusable bag at the store, but you can't bring a plastic bag, and they encourage you to bring a cloth bag. That was just something that this, as of this date, no more plastic bags. And that simple regulation, now when I go to other states, I'm like, whoa, look at all these plastic bags. Like, I don't need that. I've got cloth bags in my car. So it was a political solution. It was regulation that changed that. But how do you think the work you're making can push people to take that step?
It's like I said, if I can just get people to ask themselves some kind of question, if I can send someone into a place of introspection, whether it's a coffee mug that they have with a reusable or a disposable plastic bag on the surface of it, or whatever it may be, if I can cause that introspective process, then maybe that helps. I think that's one of the best things I can do. But yeah, it's like you said, legislation is pretty important. I think it's extremely important. It's good to vote and make your voice heard.
Yeah, and also there are think tanks out there proposing legislation that is environmentally friendly. So you can donate money to those think tanks, and then by default you're helping this process along. You can, call your local congressman. There's all these things that you can do. I think though that what with environmentalism we're always fighting against is apathy, which is just like, I can't do anything, it doesn't matter. Which is hard. I mean, there's like, how do you fight apathy? I don't think you have an answer. I'm just saying it's a rhetorical question.
Yeah, I think that's another great question. I mean, apathy, you're exactly right. I think apathy is probably the most detrimental thing that can to this entire thing, on an individual basis. So I desire all this forgiveness for individuals. I think we're just trying to get by. But at the same time, I think it's really important to try to be green, to try to do, if you're trying to bring your bag to the grocery store, if you're trying to do whatever it is that you're doing, that's a good thing. That means that you're thinking about it. That means that you care about it.
You finished school and are now teaching in Denver. So can you talk a little bit about building community out there and just kind of moving to that area?
So I moved here in 2020, which was a crazy time to move across the country from Pennsylvania. I had been teaching at Penn State for a couple years post grad school, and then COVID hit, and then teaching studio ceramics was a nightmare, as many people listening know. And one of my best friends, John Domenico, had been talking to me for some time about this nonprofit that he wanted to start out in Denver. And he has his family owns this winery here in Denver, and they have this property with this really amazing winery and all of this space. When he was 19 years old, he built a huge Onagama wood kiln here on the property. And anyway, long story short, he's had this idea to create an art-based nonprofit here. And he had been talking to me about this. At the time, I had applied to several residencies. I didn't really know where I was going to land or where I was going to end up. COVID was crazy. And we just decided to move to Denver to help start that nonprofit. It's called La Serra Collective. And I'm still here doing that. And I'm on the board there, and it's moving along great. And in the meantime, I also got hired to teach at DU, which is University of Denver. And that's been amazing. It's amazing to do that. I teach adjunct there, 2 classes a year. I also started teaching a little bit at Arapahoe Community College, which has been great. And it's kind of the perfect amount. Working with La Serra, teaching adjunct of 1 or 2 classes a semester, and then also being at home. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and my wife works full time. So it's a busy life. So it's kind of the perfect amount of teaching. I love to teach. So it's kind of great.
And having the intellectual stimulation of being able to talk to students and go get out of the house, I think is really helpful for an art practice, because they're doing something totally different every day. Like I'm always amazed at how variable each class period of teaching is because the students are just coming to it with different experience.
It's so amazing. I love that. Yeah, I mean, and I get ideas from them all the time. One of the things that I honestly try to do, maybe it's a little sneaky, but I try to formulate my assignments to that end. For instance, one of the assignments that I just had students do recently was to recreate historically inspired big gulp cups, and we walked to 7-Eleven and filled them with Slurpees, which was awesome.
This is kind of a tangent, but I promise it'll make sense in the end. You went to Arizona State and then later taught at Penn State. Like these are two of America's largest institutions in terms of undergraduate numbers. What do you think the big school experience gives an undergraduate versus the small school experience? So like the community college, Arapahoe Community College, like you're going to know those students because it's not a 50,000 person campus. As to where Penn State, like those undergrads that come into the classes, it's almost like being a number in a prison. You know what I mean? Like there's just so many people that I think they maybe get lost. So can you compare that kind of massive school experience to a small school experience?
Yeah, I think some of exactly what you said. I mean, the numbers thing is really interesting. One of the upsides to a really big school, I think, is just the resources available. If you are someone who is ambitious enough to take advantage of those resources, right? But Penn State or Arizona State, they have all of these different programs. They have huge science laboratories, or you name it. At Penn State, weirdly enough, there was a glass hot shop, but it was not in the School of Art. It was in the School of Material Science and Engineering. It existed entirely for the engineers to experience glass as a material. And most of the artists, most of the art students at Penn State didn't even know about it. It's the weirdest thing. So I don't know. Yeah, I think the number of students is different, although typically it's a 15-person class, no matter where you are, or somewhere in that range. Um, but yeah, I mean, a community college is very different. Community college is different, I think, especially because of the community that's there. And some of that community is there seems to always be at a community college a group of older retired people, which is reminiscent to, I think it sort of reminds me of, I used to teach at a community center, the Mesa Arts Center in Mesa, Arizona. I used to teach, and there's a group, that's like most of the students there. And so it's really interesting at a community college for these students who are maybe 19, 20 years old to be working alongside people who are retired and in their 70s and have all of this life experience. And so that probably has a lot of effect on the critique that takes place. And the conversation in the studio is different for good and bad. I think it's different.
You talk about the age gap. I'm teaching at my local community college as well. And my oldest student is 76 and my youngest is 18. I've learned that I have to phrase things differently because interestingly, from a language perspective, I'm of neither of those generations. So in the classroom, you'll hear slang that is from all different generations. And sometimes I can tell the young kids don't understand the older people. And I'm sure it's the same the other way around.
Oh, it's wild. It's so funny. I mean, I feel like I experienced exactly what you're talking about just the last time I taught at Arapahoe. I mean, it was amazing. I had a student that was 22 and students that were like probably, 76. I have to somehow find a way to relate to them all.
We talk about art as if it's a great unifier, and I think it is, Like I think these types of learning environments bring people together in ways that other institutions don't do. I think that's one of like great services that art institutions bring is it's a cultural and demographic divider that brings us together.
Yeah, I do think it's a really a positive of places like that. And also community centers like the one that I was talking about, Mesa Art Center, or so many others. It does a lot for that.
To wrap up, can you plug your website and also social media if people want to get in touch and see the work?
BradleyKlem.com. And my Instagram is Bradley Klem Ceramics.
I also wanted to thank you publicly for writing a section of the book.
No, thank you.
I was like totally intimidated to even take on China paint. And I was like, no, Brad knows this stuff. And you said yes. So I really appreciate that.
I'm honored to do it. I was so honored to do it, honestly. I enjoyed it very much. So thank you as well. I mean, it was great. And it's beautiful. I love the book.
Oh, thanks, man. Good to see you.
You too.
I'd like to thank Brad for coming on the show. I appreciate the wonderful work that he makes. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and the Archie Bray Foundation. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, we do need support for 2025, so please get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.